They thought I was invisible. A harmless man clinging to the shadow of my powerful wife. A husband who smiled too softly, spoke too little, and never lifted his head when they mocked me. What they didn't know was that I saw everything. Every whisper. Every smirk. Every plan they made against her. They mistook my silence for weakness, my patience for fear. But foresight is sharper than a blade. And when you know where every betrayal will come from, you don't need to strike first. You simply wait, and let your enemies walk straight into the noose they tied for themselves. I was patient, yes. Quiet, yes. But weak? Never. Because while they thought they were playing a game with my wife's company, with her heart, with her life, they didn't realize I was already moving the pieces. They laughed at me then. But in the end, I was the one who laughed last, as I watched them burn. My name isn't important. Not to them, at least. To my wife, I was everything, but to the people who filled her boardrooms and banquet halls, I was nothing more than a trophy husband. She was the CEO. The woman everyone admired, feared, envied. Tall, poised, with that kind of presence that could silence an entire room just by walking in. They said she was unshakable. Untouchable. But to me, at home, she was just Sarah, bare feet curled under the blanket, head on my chest, whispering how exhausted she was from carrying the weight of wolves every single day. It was in those quiet moments, when she stripped away the armor of her position, that I saw her vulnerability. She never showed anyone else that side. Only me. And in return, I gave her the one thing nobody else could, clarity. You always notice things before I do, she once murmured as we lay in bed, city lights casting silver patterns across her face. The way people's eyes shift, the way they hesitate when they lie. You catch it all. I smiled faintly, brushing her hair from her forehead. They don't know me, love. If they did, I let the thought hang in the air. She kissed my chest softly. They'd fear you. I didn't answer. But inside, I knew she was right. The outside world, however, saw a different picture. At every company gala, I played my role flawlessly, the quiet man standing by his wife's side, smiling politely, raising a glass when needed, never pushing into conversations that weren't mine. And every time, the whispers came. That's him. The husband. He doesn't even speak. What does she see in him? Must be nice, being kept by a CEO. They thought I didn't hear. They thought I didn't care. But I always heard. I always cared. And I never forgot a single face that mocked me. One night, during a shareholders' dinner, the jabs were particularly sharp. A group of her so-called allies had gathered at a round table near the bar, wine in hand, smirks curling their lips. Sarah could have married anyone, one of them sneered. And she chose him. A man who doesn't even open his mouth in a room like this. They laughed. A cruel, hollow laugh that echoed in my ears even as I pretended to sip my drink. Sarah noticed, of course. She always noticed. She touched my hand under the table, her thumb brushing against mine. Ignore them, she whispered, her smile never faltering as she addressed the room. They don't matter. I squeezed her hand gently, my gaze fixed on the men who had spoken. One day, I murmured so only she could hear, they'll see. They'll all see. She glanced at me, puzzled for a moment by the edge in my tone. Then she smiled, trusting me. Always trusting. The truth was, I never minded being underestimated. It was useful. Power works best when it's hidden. Let them think I was weak. Let them believe I was blind to their scheming, their greed, their ambition. Because while they mocked me, I was studying them. Every careless insult, every false smile, every impatient tap of a finger during a deal, it was all information. I watched who leaned in too eagerly during negotiations, who avoided my wife's eyes when they spoke, who lingered too long around her when they thought no one noticed. I saw cracks in their alliances, fractures they thought invisible. And I remembered them. All of them. Sarah once teased me about it. You sit there so quietly, love, but when we get home you recount everything I missed. How do you do that? I shrugged lightly. People don't realize how loud they are when they think no one's listening. She laughed softly, then looked at me with that rare softness she reserved only for me. They're wrong about you. They all are. You're not weak. You're patient. And patience is dangerous. Her words lingered with me that night, long after she fell asleep beside me. Patience is dangerous. Yes, it was. Especially when combined with foresight. I didn't need to make enemies yet. I didn't need to confront them. My time would come. And when it did, every single one of those men who had mocked me would regret ever looking down on Sarah's silent husband. For now, though, I played my part. The shadow beside the queen. The quiet figure no one feared. But in the silence of my own mind, I could already see the future. And it wasn't theirs. It was mine. It started small. It always does. A hesitation in a handshake. A smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. A careless word spoken when they thought I wasn't listening. At first, I thought perhaps I was overanalyzing. I've always had that tendency, to dissect people, to pick apart their gestures, their tones, their silences. But with Sarah's business partners, it wasn't imagination. It was a pattern. One evening, during a late-night strategy meeting in her glass-walled office, I noticed it clearly for the first time. We were all gathered around the long mahogany table. Sarah at the head, as always, her sharp gaze scanning the presentation slides. Beside her sat Richard, her CFO. A man she trusted almost as much as she trusted herself. He'd been with her since the early days of the company. But that night, when Sarah announced plans to expand into a new market, I saw it. A flicker of something across Richard's face. Not excitement. Not even doubt. Greed. The kind of greed that flashes like a shadow before a storm. I watched his fingers drum against the table, just once, before he forced a smile. It's ambitious, he said, his tone perfectly supportive. But if anyone can pull it off, it's you, Sarah. She smiled back at him, grateful, never catching the way his eyes darted briefly toward one of the other board members, Elaine. A glance too quick, too rehearsed. Most people wouldn't notice. But I did. The next week, I caught Elaine at the shareholders' dinner. She was laughing too loudly at something one of the competitors had said. I lingered near the bar, half hidden by the throng of guests, while her voice carried across the room. Sarah won't see it coming, she whispered, leaning in closer to a tall man with slicked back hair. She trusts too much. By the time she realizes, it'll be too late. My grip on the glass tightened, but I didn't move. Not yet. Instead, I let the information settle into place, another piece of the puzzle I was assembling silently. At home, Sarah began to sense it too, though in her own way. I don't know, she admitted one night, curling into me on the couch, her shoes kicked off carelessly by the door. Richard has been different. Distracted. And Elaine, she's been pushing me on partnerships I'm not entirely comfortable with. I stroked her hair gently, keeping my voice even. And you trust them? She sighed. I want to. I've built this company with them at my side. But sometimes. I wonder if they see me as a partner or just a stepping stone. I wanted to tell her then. Wanted to lay everything bare, the glances, the whispers, the betrayals already blooming beneath the surface. But I didn't. Not yet. Maybe they just don't see what you see, I said softly. She tilted her head to look at me, her eyes searching mine. And what do you see? I smiled faintly. Patterns. Cracks. Her lips curved into a tired smile, though I could tell she thought I was being poetic. She didn't realize how literal I meant it. It grew worse over time. Richard began arriving late to meetings, offering half-hearted excuses. Elaine grew bolder in her suggestions, steering conversations toward deals that seemed to benefit outside interests more than Sarah's vision. And then there was Victor, an investor known for his charm, his way of slithering into every conversation like smoke. He started showing Sarah more attention, laughing too much at her jokes, leaning just a little too close during discussions. Most saw it as harmless flirting. I saw it for what it was, an attempt to destabilize her, to create tension, to weaken her focus. One night, after a particularly grueling dinner with him, Sarah collapsed onto the bed, rubbing her temples. "Victor's exhausting," she muttered. "Always smiling, always flattering. I can't tell if he wants to help us, or bury us." I sat beside her, watching her reflection in the mirror as she removed her earrings. "Both," I said quietly. She looked at me in surprise, then gave a small laugh. "You and your instincts. They've never been wrong," I replied. Her smile faltered slightly at the weight in my voice. But again, she brushed it off, too trusting, too unwilling to believe how close betrayal really was. My silence grew heavier. Each day, I gathered more fragments of truth, piecing them together like a map of the coming war. A handshake too firm. A compliment too sharp. A missed meeting, an odd phone call, a document left carelessly on a desk. They thought I wasn't paying attention. But I was always watching. And with every detail, the unease inside me deepened. Did I warn Sarah now? Reveal what I knew and risk sounding paranoid? Or did I stay quiet, let them play their hand, and catch them in the act? It was a question that gnawed at me, night after night. One evening, I overheard Richard and Elaine in the hallway outside Sarah's office. I had lingered behind, pretending to take a call, when their voices drifted around the corner. "She won't suspect a thing," Richard said, his voice low. "By the time she realizes we've rerouted the contracts, she'll be too busy putting out fires." Elaine chuckled softly. "And her husband? Please. He's harmless. He barely speaks. He won't do anything." I closed my eyes briefly, forcing down the surge of cold laughter that threatened to escape. Harmless. Yes, let them believe that. That night, Sarah fell asleep quickly, exhausted from another 12-hour day of meetings and negotiations. I lay beside her, staring at the ceiling, the weight of what I knew pressing down on me. Her steady breathing filled the silence, a reminder of the woman I loved, the woman I had promised to protect. And yet, even now, she was surrounded by wolves wearing sheep's clothing. I turned my head slightly, watching the rise and fall of her chest, the softness in her face that no one else ever saw. I already knew how they'd betray her. I had seen the pieces moving long before they thought they had made the first move. The question was, should I let them try first? The first knife cut deeper because it came from a friend. Her name was Linda. She'd been Sarah's college roommate, a bridesmaid at our wedding, the kind of woman Sarah once said she'd trust with her life. For years, Linda had played the part of the loyal confidant, offering advice, checking in late at night, cheering Sarah on through every deal. And then one morning, Sarah's assistant came rushing into her office, pale-faced, holding a printed email that should never have existed. It was a forwarded message from a competitor. Attached were confidential files, our upcoming strategies, proposals, projections. Files only a handful of people had access to. Sarah froze. I could see it in her eyes as she scanned the page, her lips parting in disbelief. "Linda," she whispered. No, she wouldn't. But she had. The proof was right there in black and white. Linda had sold her out. I stood behind Sarah, my hand gently resting on her shoulder. "I didn't say I told you so. I didn't need to." Her voice trembled. "Why? After everything, why?" I had no answer for her then. But inside, I already knew. Greed. Envy. The same disease I had been watching spread through every corner of her circle. The second betrayal was subtler. Richard, her trusted CFO, had been siphoning deals quietly, discreetly. Not outright theft, but manipulation. Steering clients into mutually beneficial side agreements that funneled money away from Sarah's company and into ventures tied to his own name. It was Sarah who first noticed the numbers not adding up. "I don't understand," she muttered one evening at the kitchen table, papers spread in front of her. "Revenue should have increased after those contracts. Instead, we're plateauing. Some of the deals, they're vanishing." I sat across from her, watching her brow crease in worry. "And Richard?" She hesitated. "He says it's just fluctuations." But, her hands gripped the papers tighter. "I don't know anymore." I studied her face, the cracks beginning to show in her once unshakable confidence. And I hated Richard in that moment, not just for his betrayal, but for what he was doing to her. She trusted him like a brother. And he was carving her from the inside out. And then came Victor. The snake I had seen slithering toward her since the beginning. The rival who cloaked ambition in charm, manipulation in flattery. He invited Sarah to dinner, under the guise of discussing partnerships. I went with her, of course, though his eyes flickered with irritation when he saw me walk in beside her. We dined at an upscale restaurant, candlelight flickering against polished glassware. Victor spent the evening drowning her in compliments. "You're remarkable, Sarah," he said smoothly, swirling his wine. "Truly. The sharpest mind in the industry. But tell me, doesn't it ever get lonely? Carrying all of this on your shoulders?" Sarah smiled politely, dismissing it. "I have my team. I have my husband." She reached for my hand under the table. Victor's eyes flicked to me. For a moment, his charming mask slipped, just barely. Then it was back again. "A man like me," he continued, leaning closer, "I'd do anything for a woman like you. Imagine what we could build, together. You don't need to carry him along. You could have more." My blood ran cold, but I stayed still, expression unreadable. Sarah froze, her eyes widening. "Victor," she said sharply, pulling her hand back. "That's out of line." He chuckled softly, as if it were all a harmless joke. But I saw it for what it was, an attempt to break us, to plant a seed of doubt in her mind. On the drive home, Sarah was silent. Her hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary, her knuckles white. Finally, she whispered, "Is this what they all think? That I'd be better off without you?" I looked at her. She didn't meet my eyes. "They're wrong," I said simply. But the damage was done. The betrayals had cut her deep, each one leaving wounds she couldn't hide anymore. In the weeks that followed, Sarah began to crumble. She doubted her decisions. She second-guessed her instincts. Meetings that once energized her now left her drained. She snapped at people who didn't deserve it, retreated into silence when she used to command the room with ease. At night, she curled into me, smaller than I had ever seen her, her voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe I'm not as strong as I thought," she said. "Maybe I was blind." I held her close, brushing my hand over her hair. "No. You trusted me. That's not blindness. That's humanity." But inside, I burned. Because they had done this to her. Linda with her treachery. Richard with his theft. Victor with his poisoned words. Piece by piece, they thought they were breaking her. And maybe they were. But what they didn't realize was that in trying to shatter her, they had awakened something far worse. Me. I began to change. On the outside, I remained the same, the quiet husband, the patient shadow, the man who spoke only when necessary. But inside, I was colder now. Sharper. Every betrayal I witnessed carved away what little mercy I had left for them. I watched Sarah's tears fall onto the pillow at night. I listened as her voice shook during meetings she once dominated. And with every moment of her pain, the fire inside me grew steadier, harder, more controlled. They thought they had weakened her. They thought they had left me powerless. But they hadn't broken us. They had created the perfect reason for revenge. They thought they'd broken her, I whispered to myself one night as I stood in the dark, watching the city lights blink outside our window. They didn't realize, they'd only awakened me. They taught me to be patient by calling me useless. That patience hardened into something colder the longer they laughed, an instrument I learned to tune. When revenge became necessary, it wasn't born from rage alone. It was born from inventory, names, habits, desires, weaknesses. I gathered them like a careful collector, cataloging each man's appetite and each woman's small betrayals until a pattern emerged. Foresight, in my hands, was simply preparation. The first step was humility. I kept being the man everyone expected me to be, the quiet husband, the man with the soft smile and the polite nod. I smiled at their barbed jokes. I listened when Victor droned. I let Elaine assume my silence was ignorance. They never looked for danger in the man who never spoke, they were looking for it in the woman who did. So I hid there, in plain sight. At night I mapped them. I traced routes from boardroom to bar, from a thrown-away receipt to the offshore accounts Richard hinted at when he thought no one was listening. I learned when Linda left work early and who she called on weekends. I memorized Victor's calendar, his charity events, his late lunches with journalists, the law firm partners who owed him favors. Each detail became a lever I could one day pull. I did not rush. You cannot rush foresight. You plan, you bait, you wait for greed and vanity to do the work for you. My first move was quiet and legal, almost painfully boring to anyone who expected fireworks. I began by cleaning our perimeter. I audited nothing publicly, nothing dramatic. Small confirmations, a scanned contract here, a cross-checked invoice there, a quiet request to IT to log access times for sensitive folders. I phrased it as routine, just housekeeping, so nobody paid attention. But each logged access, each changed permission, each flagged anomaly was a pebble thrown at a dam. Then I planted a rumor. Not vicious, not outright false, just precise enough to shift the balance of trust. In an offhand conversation with a junior associate, I suggested that certain partnerships might be revisited under new scrutiny. The associate repeated it at lunch. By dinner, it had changed the tenor in the elevator. People lean toward risk when they think a leader is uncertain. That was my goal, make their hunger rise. I used their language against them. Richard loved numbers and certainty. So I fed into his need for control by leaking a fake opportunity that required rapid reallocation of capital, enough to make him twitch. Elaine wanted influence. I let her overhear that a committee might reward her preferred initiative. Victor craved affection and recognition. I made him imagine a future in which Sarah would be his, not by force, but by the slow, seductive whisper of a plausible alternative. Nothing I did was illegal. That wasn't the point. The point was to rearrange the chessboard until their moves became predictable. They obliged. Richard's first mistake was petty arrogance. He cynically rerouted a vendor contract into a shell company under the guise of expedited processing. He thought it clever, a way to skim a little profit off the top without drawing attention. He didn't consider that I had already requested a paper trail for that very vendor, something I'd phrased as due diligence after a late-night conversation with Sarah about tightening compliance. The logs were there now, innocuous in their existence until the right moment. I watched him tighten when I brought up the vendor in a casual conversation at a board lunch. He laughed too loud, his hands betrayed him. I stored the memory. Linda's greed was louder. I dropped an anonymous note in a box of company swag destined for her office, nothing incriminating. Only an everyday document with a line highlighted about confidentiality breaches and the consequences under the non-compete clauses she'd signed years ago. She panicked and called an old contact for advice, and that call was overheard by the wrong person. Small mistakes lead to bigger ones when you're greedy, and Linda began to fear exposure. Fear makes people sloppy. Victor, always hungry for theater, was the easiest to bait. I let him overhear a conversation that implied Sarah was considering a high-profile merger, no details, just enough to set his overripe ambition alight. He began to maneuver publicly, making grand promises to investors, flattering journalists, taking meetings that left footprints. I watched him stir the pot, making alliances and enemies in equal measure, convinced he was building a ladder to climb over Sarah's shadow. But the genius of the plan wasn't simply letting them move, it was making them move into each other. I fed each one the same whisper of opportunity: make a play, secure your future, hedge your bets. Each thought they could outmaneuver the others. Richard made side deals that slowly siphoned clients away. Elaine pushed for strategic partnerships that benefited her broader network. Victor tried to seduce Sarah into his orbit, but when rebuffed he whispered rumors to the press about company instability. And their gestures became the evidence I needed. I built a chain that tied motive to action and action to exposure. Every lie they told, I let them tell publicly. Every secret they thought safe, I made visible not by stealing it but by nudging it into places where it would be seen. A forwarded email here, a misfiled draft there, small errors that would accumulate into undeniable proof. The more they scrambled, the more obvious the seams. There were setbacks, of course. Foresight is not prophecy, it's educated guessing. The first real threat came when Richard nearly discovered the audit logs I'd quietly commissioned. He had a hunch someone was watching the vendor accounts and narrowed the search to me, his logic circling around any person with access. His suspicion was natural, predictable. He began to poke, sending off innocuous-sounding emails that tested permissions, making quiet calls to IT that could have revealed my trail. I felt my chest tighten when I read his terse question: did you authorize a change on the Thames contract? It was too close. For a day I considered stepping back, abandoning the plan while his attention was hot. Fear is a practical thing. But then I realized something useful: panic is contagious. If he believed someone was onto him, he'd climb faster, cut corners, make errors. So I did the opposite of what instinct demanded. I let him think he had the upper hand. I smiled when we sat at dinner, allowed myself to be teased about being a guardian of spreadsheets. At home, I took Sarah's hand and laughed at a joke about boring audits. This calmness was salt in a wound. Richard's paranoia grew. He made a misfile, sent a copy of a side agreement to the wrong recipient. That error was the hinge. Another time, a junior partner nearly exposed my orchestration when he privately confronted me after hearing a rumor. "Why are you asking about Victor's lunches?" he demanded, voice low in the hallway. For a heartbeat I saw how close we were to being unmasked. I could have deflected, blamed boredom, claimed curiosity. Instead, I told him the truth, but a spared version, because if he's careless, he makes Sarah's job harder. He nodded, satisfied, and walked away. The truth, when selective, looks like innocence. My wife began to notice the calmness. One evening, in our kitchen, she asked me plainly, "You're unervingly composed. Are you hiding something from me?" She was searching my face, tiredness pooling in the corners of her eyes. "No," I said. "Only that I trust you." It was both a shield and a mirror. She wanted an explanation for my unnatural stillness. I could have told her everything: the quiet reconnaissance, the baiting, the evidence I was collecting. But then she would worry. She would lose sleep and begin to second-guess decisions, and perhaps, for all my planning, act rashly in front of predators. She needed to feel secure. So I kept my mouth closed and my hands steady. Sometimes the plan bent against me. Elaine discovered that one of her preferred partners had been leaked confidentially to another board member. Furious, she confronted me in a corridor. I met her coolly. "You're reading too much into it," I said. She left red-faced, muttering about paranoia. In truth, I had deliberately let her find that draft, knowing she would act on it, that she would accelerate deals that exposed her allegiances. She tried to outmaneuver me by creating her own paper trail, one that later became key evidence of collusion. Her haste was a trap of her own making. I made use of allies, too, discreet favors repaid cleverly. The junior associate who had once spread my planted rumor owed me a small promotional push. A legal aide from Sarah's team was grateful for a dinner invite. I nudged him to reopen a small investigation into vendor practices. These were people whose careers I'd quietly boosted with a polite conversation or a recommendation. They were not pawns but partners, willing participants because what I offered looked like small professional advancement. They would later supply testimony or corroboration when the house of cards toppled. Another setback nearly broke me. Victor was unpredictable, a live wire. He sensed he was being played and nearly turned the game on me. He arranged an extravagant charity gala and used it to create a spectacle that diverted attention away from internal scrambles. His contacts in the press were savvy. He fed them carefully crafted talking points about leadership turmoil that painted Sarah as unstable. For a frantic week, we saw stock dips and whisper campaigns. I wrestled with a tempting, dangerous idea: confront him publicly, expose him at the gala with a flourish. But that would have risked making Sarah look embroiled in scandal, and I could not let her reputation be collateral damage. Instead, I worked at a quieter angle. I contacted a journalist, one I'd met through a charity I never attended, and fed her a different story, one about a whistleblower with documents hinting at corruption. It wasn't a lie. It was a redirect. Victor, needing validation, responded by making his moves more brazen. He demanded exclusives, he leaked a false internal memo to the press, and in his overconfidence, he left a traceable line to Elaine and Richard. His need for attention, his compulsion to be seen as decisive, became his undoing. The moment of truth arrived the way it always does, not with drama, but with the slow, logical accumulation of facts. I had the logs, the misfiled contracts, the emails. I had recordings, not surreptitious, but consented to meeting minutes that revealed conflicts of interest. I had witnesses who would speak because I had helped their careers at a time they needed it. I had Linda's call records, Richard's side agreements, Victor's public promise to investors that contradicted a private memo. Each element alone looked like plausible deniability. Together, they were a case. When I finally began to assemble the evidence into a dossier, I did so like a craftsman. I knew the threshold for public exposure, the way boards react when the press threatens governance, and the legal lines that force internal investigations. I formatted documents with dates and chains of custody. I organized timelines that paired suspicious transactions with meetings and phone calls. I crafted questions, public, official, impossible to deflect, that when asked in the right forum would leave them stumbling. There were nights I doubted myself. The human part of me, the man who loved Sarah because she was vulnerable, wondered if I was sinking too far into vengeance. Would I become like them? Was my calmness a mask for cruelty? I considered stopping. I considered going to Sarah and telling her everything, letting her choose how to proceed. But I knew her. She would be consumed by the fight and scarred for it. She would become a version of herself I had no interest in losing. I refused to hand her that cost. So I moved forward, one careful, cold step at a time. I smiled when they mocked me, because I already knew what would break them, their own hunger. I let them eat of their desires until they choked on the last bite. And somewhere beneath the planning, in the quiet hours before dawn, I rehearsed the day I would stop smiling and begin to speak. They fell like dominoes, one deliberate push at a time, and the sound of each body hitting the floor was quieter than I expected and somehow louder than anything I had lived through before. I had rehearsed every exposure until it fit together like a lock and key. When the lock turned, everything inside clicked open. The board meeting was the stage. The room smelled of polished wood and stale coffee. Light from the atrium made the glass wall glow like a theater proscenium. Sarah sat at the head of the table, a small island of calm in a sea of well-tailored suits. Her posture was the old posture, the one I missed, straight, steady, a woman who still wanted to be a leader and not a wounded thing. I sat where I always did, next to her, my hands folded, my face the same quiet, unreadable face everyone had known for years. I had prepared the dossier like an artisan prepares a final piece. It was physical paper because paper makes things real in a way screens never do, sturdy, tangible, impossible to dismiss as a leak or a hack. I had a copy for the ethics committee, one for legal, and 3 for the press, should we need to force the hand of those who preferred cover-ups. Richard began the meeting with numbers, as always. He loved numbers because they let him lie elegantly. He spoke about projections, about margins, lines and graphs that dipped then arced with false optimism. The room nodded, lulled. I watched him from the corner of my eye, watching the man who had thought himself untouchable. He had no idea I had mapped the exact route his arrogance would take him. When the time came, Sarah asked for questions. The room softened. This is when they all performed their loyalties. I leaned forward and asked something simple. Richard, could you walk us through the Thames vendor allocation again? There were a few line items I'd like clarified. My voice was casual, an innocuous prompt. But that question unspooled him. He adjusted his glasses. Of course, it was simply an expedited contract, well within our margin. He started, smooth as silk, until I slid one of the printed invoices across the table. It landed with a soft slap that was louder than it needed to be. You'll find, I said, keeping my tone flat, that the routing of payment appears to have included. I watched his face when he read it. Color drained. He said nothing. Sarah's expression shifted from curiosity to concern in a single heartbeat. What is this? She asked. I let the room breathe a small, sanctified silence. Then I began to lay it out. Dates. Recipients. Time stamps that matched the nights he was in meetings. The vendor that didn't exist. The shell account traced convincingly, legally, to a consultancy Richard had quietly co-founded with a third party. I read the thread of emails aloud, letting the words fall into the boardroom like cold rain. Richard tried to laugh. This is a misunderstanding, accounting jargon. It's an embezzlement, someone from the legal department said. And it's documented. He rose, voice tight. You can't, this is slander. I handed another folder to the head of legal. There are signed disclosures, transaction logs, and a recorded call where you authorize the transfer, Richard. I had arranged for one of his less careful contacts to record a portion of the evening under the guise of a promotional clip. The recording captured far more than a staged chat. It captured him promising confidential market-moving information to an investor who, unknown to Victor, was on a short list for a compliance investigation. The investor was hungry. He wanted leverage. He forwarded the recording to regulatory authorities. I also arranged a different kind of exposure. I planted a private message, fabricated but plausible, on an internal messenger that suggested Victor had been pressuring a junior executive for favors in exchange for a partnership. It was the message that made journalists sniff a scandal. It suggested coercion. Victor's need to be seen as decisive turned into reckless behavior. He leaked a memo to a friendly column, shouting his innocence from the rooftops, but in the process he contradicted publicly available filings. The contradictions multiplied like cracks in a windshield. When the press finally descended, predictive headlines, quiet legal threats, an ethics inquiry, Victor's contacts began to peel away. The investors who once smiled at his jokes now asked pointed questions. Sponsors cancelled appearances. His name was threaded through articles that painted him as opportunistic and predatory. The most satisfying moment, if reward can exist in such a place, was during the press conference when a reporter asked, on live feed, whether Victor had ever used personal influence to access confidential information. He attempted to answer. His words were hollow. My jaw tightened as he tried to shift the blame and then, in a gesture so Victor it hurt, he blamed Sarah. He had finally crossed the line he hadn't realized existed. When you try to smear the woman he had hurt, you make her defense righteous. The room rallied. Legal brought forward our collected proof. His empire, built on charm and borrowed credibility, began to leak. Each downfall was surgical and public in its precision. I gave them the rope and then tightened it by letting them use it with gusto. Between each exposure, I was careful. I attended to Sarah's wounds. I did what I could to rebuild safe ground beneath her feet. I created buffer meetings, recommended interim heads where public perception needed steering, sat with her through late-night strategy sessions while she rebuilt the language of trust with her remaining team. I did not make speeches. I fixed things. I filed documents. I introduced new vetting protocols that were framed as modernization. If she suspected my hand was on the wheel, she didn't say so. She was exhausted and fragile and yet, in a way that made me ache, resolute. One night, after a particularly brutal week, Richard's legal team threatening countersuits, Press breathless over Victor, Linda spiraling into denial, Sarah and I sat on the balcony with glasses of wine. The city spread below us like a map of tiny fires. "You've been different," she said, not accusing but searching. She stirred the ice in her glass like it could dissolve truth. "Calmer. Colder. I don't mean that to sound cruel. I mean, how are you so steady?" Her voice cracked at the end. "Are you hiding something from me?" I had rehearsed an answer 1,000 times. I had written versions that were honest and versions that were lies. But honesty is a weapon you must wield carefully, it cuts both ways. I wanted to be transparent. I also wanted to protect her from the ugliness of what I had learned to do. "I worked," I said simply. "I'm doing what I promised when we got married. I promised to stand by you." My hands warmed around the glass. "I am just standing." She laughed softly, the sound of it taut. "And they thought you were harmless. They were wrong." When the final sequence of exposures came, a cascade I had engineered to appear organic, it felt less orchestrated and more inevitable. I had made sure the legal filings would catch the right kind of attention, that regulatory notices would align with board votes, that each of them would find their reputations collapsing under the weight of their own choices. They accused one another in whispered corridors and printed memos. They scrambled for alibis. Their attempts to save themselves only tangled them further. Richard sued, then folded when the evidence made his case untenable. He resigned. Linda fled overseas with a statement about personal mistakes and a brief, angry media tour where she blamed circumstance and not choice. Victor's donations were rescinded. His charitable board asked him to step down. The investor who had taken Victor's promises for leverage turned him over to investigators when he realized the scandal could ruin his own deals. I watched them go. I did not gloat publicly. My satisfaction was private and cold and final. I had wanted them not simply removed, but revealed, so that the people who had trusted them, the clients, the junior associates, the honest workers who had been collateral damage in their schemes, could see the truth. Justice, in my design, had to look like consequence. There was pushback. There were questions about my methods, insinuations that I had engineered a personal vendetta. I expected that. It's the reflex of people who have always depended on the power structures that get upset when those structures fail them. Legal asked for transparency. The ethics committee asked for documentation. I provided every piece, catalogued, time-stamped, validated. I had not broken the law. I had bent perception, reshaped narrative, and used the mechanisms of corporate governance to do what governance is supposed to do when it works: protect the company. When the board finally voted to reinstate trust, whatever that meant, Sarah stood before them, head held higher than I had seen in months. She thanked no one and thanked everyone, all at once. The people who remained were those who had proven steady in the storm. The company stabilized under a new framework we'd installed, safeguards I had argued for in 1,000 small, patient ways. Afterwards, when the press subsided and the rooms emptied, Sarah found me in the small, quiet office she used when she needed to think. She closed the doors softly, lingered by the desk, then turned to me with an expression that made my chest spasm. "Was it you?" Her voice was small. Not surprised. Not accusing. Curious in the way someone asks whether a cure was administered by a dangerous medicine. "Did you plan all of this?" I could have taken a long time to answer. I could have spun it into a speech about protection and strategy and love. Instead I said the truth, and the only thing I had left that felt like truth, a clean, cold sentence. "I only did what they forced me to," I said. My fingers found hers on the desk, calloused from work she never saw. "I told you, love, one day, they'd fear me." She breathed in. For a moment her face softened into relief, then something else, something like grief. Not for herself, for what we had done, but for the cost that had been paid by both of us. She sat down on the edge of the desk and we both were silent. We had won. The company was intact. The wolves were removed. But the victory tasted of iron. When she finally looked up at me, tears breaking into small, sharp points on her cheeks, she said, quietly, like someone reading an old wound aloud, You planned all this?" "Yes," I said. "I planned it." She let out a small laugh, a sound that had both apology and wonder in it. "You were always more dangerous than I let myself admit." "I was always protecting you," I said. "Even from the people who called me harmless." She placed her forehead against mine. The city hummed beyond the windows, indifferent. We stayed there for a long time, two people who had been remade by fire. Later, when the boardrooms were quiet and the headlines moved on, I kept doing the small things. I attended the audits I had insisted on, the compliance workshops, the public relations meetings that made sure the company's face was both honest and strong. I taught Sarah to see the small tells I had once seen alone. She listened, slowly, the way people listen when they are rebuilding trust. She learned the language of suspicion in the same careful way I had learned the language of people. There are nights still, when I stand at the window and watch the city breathe, when I wonder if I went too far. But then I think of the look on her face the day the board voted in her favor. I think of how she trusted me, how she reached for me in the middle of that long, ugly week, when everything around us threatened to collapse. They thought they had broken her. They thought they had taken her down with their greed and games and seductions. They were wrong. And when they thought we were finished, they found that the man they had mocked in corner booths and whispered about at galas was the architect of their ruin. They thought I was weak. They thought my silence was surrender. They were wrong. They had awakened something they couldn't survive. The storm passed slowly. The boardrooms emptied of whispers. The journalists, hungry for blood, eventually turned their eyes to fresher scandals. Headlines faded, stock stabilized, and the company began breathing again like a patient waking from surgery. Sarah rebuilt with the steady hand of someone who had almost lost everything. She cut ties, promoted people who had proven loyal, and installed new protocols that meant no single voice would ever again hold unchecked power. And me? I went back to being the man in the shadows. The quiet husband who never raised his voice, never needed to. To the outside world, I remained what I had always been, a smile at her side, a hand at her back, a presence unremarkable enough to be forgotten. But the difference was clear now. When I walked into a room, eyes shifted. When I extended my hand, it was shaken firmly, with careful respect. No one whispered, "Kept man," anymore. No one dared. Because they knew. They knew I had been there, silent and steady, while their idols burned. They knew I had been the one who fed the firewood into the blaze. They knew I had patience sharp enough to carve out their secrets and foresight cold enough to watch them choke on their own hunger. Sarah would sometimes glance at me when the meetings grew tense. There was a quiet weight in her eyes, the memory of what she'd seen me do. She never said it aloud, but she no longer underestimated me. No one did. At night, When she leaned into me on the balcony, the city glittering below, she would sigh. "I don't know how you stayed so calm," she whispered once, her head on my shoulder. I kissed her hair and didn't answer. Because the truth was simple, and dangerous. Calm as the surface of the ocean before the storm. The enemies were gone. Linda in disgrace, Richard stripped of influence, Victor a pariah drowning in his own scandal. Their names became warnings whispered to new hires, ghost stories of what happens when betrayal runs unchecked. But I didn't need to hear their names anymore. I already knew them, etched into memory like scars. I didn't chase them further, didn't gloat, didn't linger. Revenge isn't about celebration. It's about balance. The scales had been corrected, nothing more. I had never sought glory. Only silence. Only safety, for her, for us. And now that safety was restored, I could slip back into my mask. One evening, long after the dust had settled, I stood in the office window alone. The city stretched endless, lights blinking like stars brought low. My reflection stared back at me in the glass, calm eyes, quiet posture, the same figure they had once mocked as weak. And I smiled. Because weakness is the greatest disguise. The perfect camouflage. The armor that invites underestimation. They had mocked me, dismissed me, and tried to erase me. But all along, I had been watching, waiting, calculating. They thought I was weak. But weakness is just another mask for foresight.